And I would like to introduce as the next speaker and last speaker, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. She will conclude this wonderful sequence of inspirations. She will show us her artwork and her in-depth examination of the role of us humans in designing nature, and if and how we can also try to think ourselves out of systems we produce. Can we, for example, design for other species? Daisy will introduce us to her recent work, and I'm sure we can then end this day with open hearts and inspired minds. Daisy, we will share your video links in the chat for later viewing. So if anybody wants to, Daisy has some links to YouTube videos, I think, mostly. We will share them in the chat. And if you want anybody to view them during your presentation, you need to give us instructions. Is that okay for you?
Sure. Yes, thank you so much. Now, I shared them just in case the videos are difficult to watch over Zoom, so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm just going to share my screen. So out of practice. Can you see the presentation?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, and it's wonderful to be with you all today, and also I'm very sorry that we couldn't all be together, but there is one advantage, which is that I can talk about what I've been doing over the last year since we were all meant to be together. So I want to start by leaving Earth and taking us to Mars, to a very alien landscape, perhaps for landscape architecture. And I think Mars is a really fascinating place to look back on Earth. And I think there's a lot of talk in wider sort of utopian circles that we can transform Mars and turn it into another Earth, a sort of backup planet. And this is the typical kind of illustration. This one's from National Geographic that shows how this landscape will change. So through terraforming, we will recreate Earth on Mars. And if you flip that image, you know, it explains why we need to do this, because we're trashing this planet, and you know the only escape is to go elsewhere. And this isn't a new concern. In fact, Percival Lowell, who was a 19th century businessman and astronomer, talked about the Earth going the way of Mars, and he was reflecting contemporary concerns about sort of colonial exploitation of Earth. And on a side note, he was the person who thought there were canals on Mars. So I want to talk about Mars because a couple of years ago, I was asked to create a proposal for a new work for this show, Moving to Mars, Design for the Red Planet, held by the Design Museum in London. And you might have guessed already, I'm quite critical of the idea that Mars is a backup planet, and mostly very concerned about the use of the word colonization, that somehow this sort of violent and terrible history of colonization on Earth and the impact on our environment and on different peoples is sort of somehow flung out the window when we get to another planet. And I find it very strange that we talk about it in this way. So I was asked if I wanted to propose something, and I said, well, it's going to be critical. And they said, well, it can be critical as long as it's optimistic. So this was actually a fantastic brief to come up with a work. And my proposal was called The Wilding of Mars. And what I proposed was to wild Mars. So a colonization project, but not for humans. Instead, imagining an alternative where we would just send plants as our proxies. We would colonize it, but not ever visit it. And that for me was the beginning of this exploration of what is an altruistic form of design where humans don't benefit. Can it even exist? The problem I then faced was how do you colonize Mars with plants? So this is a little clip from the work which shows some of the generated species starting to take over the Martian landscape. Very strange sound is the sound of these plants growing and the atmospheric conditions. So to actually create this, and ultimately it's a video installation in a gallery, but it's also an ecological simulation that runs over 1 million years. had to start by choosing which plants might go to Mars. And this turned out to be a fascinating and difficult problem to solve. So it turns out if you ask people at NASA or planetary geoscientists, they don't actually know. We think about Mars as a place for potatoes and tomatoes. And by that, I mean, we think of it as a place for utilitarian crops to support human life. There are also people whose job is to stop Earth life sort of colonizing the planet, to stop us infecting the planet with Earth species. But when your aim is to purposefully spread Earth species, it becomes a bit more difficult. So I decided that we would just have 16 plants in the simulation. We would start with cyanobacteria and different extremophiles that survive at the poles on Earth. So those are the organisms in the top row. And then we would move on to other kinds of extremophiles that are a bit less hardy, but could then take over. And the bottom row are desert and other, again, extreme environment plants, but that could adapt to slightly better conditions. So each plant was given a profile, and it was necessary to simplify this ecological simulation. So we didn't end up making a one-to-one map of the world. It needed to be simplified by giving each plant a kind of profile. So there were 3 different main parameters of temperature, nutrients, and water. And this diagram shows 2 of them, where each plant sort of allocated the conditions it can survive in and what it needs. So it's a simplification, but a way to address creating this work. So the idea is that it's not specified when this is or who does it, but the plants arrive on Mars. The cyanobacteria start by being deposited at the South Pole, and they, starting with one called watermelon snow, which is actually a real thing that exists on snow and turns it pink. That is used to start to melt the ice caps at the South Pole. And once there's enough water in the environment, we can start to introduce lichens and other species that can acclimatize. So we then start to see a gradual spread of life forms across the planet over the million years of the simulation. So in the gallery, this was at the Vitra Design Gallery at the Vitra Design Museum in Weil am Rhein, was the first time it was presented, and you can see that there's 12 screens, and there are actually 2 blocks of screens. On the left-hand side is one simulation, and on the right-hand side is a second simulation. So repeating the process in parallel, showing different outcomes, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And on the 3 rows of screens, you see 3 different landscapes. So you can actually, from the bottom row up, see the spread as it happens over the million years. And you'll be pleased that the whole sequence just takes 1 human hour. So it's possible to see the entire colonization. So what you actually see on the screen is moments in time, sort of this clock ticking over evolutionary timescales, not over human timescales. So this image is at the year 573,211, and it's shot as a kind of webcam view of the world. So you start to see these sort of pink splodges, which are in fact the cyanobacteria, which has now completely melted the snow, releasing water into the environment. And just on the bottom, you may not be able to see, but there's other sort of markers, including how many plants or species are in the simulation, how many new subspecies have evolved, and how many new subspecies have gone extinct. Because this was an important part of this, was that it's not a static set of pioneers, but actually we've got life evolving. Mars becomes a repository for the mechanism of life, and new species start to appear. So yeah, this is the extent of wilderness on Mars. Again, the year 573,000, but then by this is 895,000 years in, we start to see meadows forming across these Martian landscapes. The atmosphere has changed, and things like sound even travel further with an atmosphere, so you can hear more sound. So that was also added into the simulation. So I mentioned that there's 2 parallel simulations going on in the gallery, and this was important because it shows that life doesn't just go in one direction. We can see different worlds evolving at the same time. I was showing just 2 different versions. These are parallel views of the same moment in the simulation. You can see on the right there's a dust storm, on the left it's raining. But I think for me it's a way to start to explore this idea of, faced with these two versions, we begin to have to make value judgments. Which one is better? Which one do we prefer? The other feature of the work was, I mentioned the sort of evolutionary process, is that you start to see from the original pioneers through this evolutionary simulation, new species or new subspecies emerging. So as you can see, the plants actually tended to get darker through this process. These are all the new subspecies that we collected from the computer game. And they get darker because they're actually adapting to the Martian environments of harsher light with less atmosphere. So again, two parallel worlds, two parallel sets of plants evolved as a way to sort of explore how contexts can actually change what happens, but also there are broad similarities because of the environmental conditions. So you may be wondering, why am I talking about this? And how on earth did I kind of get to this point? And I spent a lot of time prior to this work, which was made 2 years ago, in a field of technology called synthetic biology. So I was working as an artist and designer with a group of scientists and engineers who were designing living things. They were actually engineering organisms, engineering DNA to make things that are useful for humans. And that experience, which was about 10 years long, which I'm not going to talk about today, sort of really opened up this idea of the word of better and the extreme faith in these circles, both in design, but also in technology and technoscience, that we can make things better using kind of human-made solutions. And to some extent, I think design is a utopian exercise. It's a process to change existing conditions to preferred or better ones, to paraphrase the sociologist Herbert Simon. And design, the sociologist Richard Howells calls it, is a utopian impulse. We make a house to improve our living conditions. And design is essentially optimistic. We express through design the belief that a better world is possible, to reference Candide, which was mentioned before. And through design, we can materialize that feeling of betterness. But things like going to Mars is a form of solutionism, which is a slightly different thing. It's the idea that design and technology will solve the problems and that human decision-making isn't part of that process, that there's a kind of absolute faith that the solution is through technology, like escaping Earth and going to Mars because we can't solve it here. And I think some of this creeps into these questions about how do we make nature better? What does it mean to solve the kinds of problems that we're facing of human-induced climate breakdown or biodiversity collapse? And this is, again, sort of the world that I came from in synthetic biology, particularly interesting because there's a belief that we can use these technologies to solve problems. But I think there's something more interesting here, which is this question of what does it mean to make nature better? And, are we making it better for ourselves? Are we trying to restore it to a certain set of conditions that would never exist because, of evolution, nature is not a static thing? Or are we trying to improve ourselves in some way? For me, this question of better has been kind of on my mind for a long time. I wrote my PhD about it. And whenever I hear this word, I'm always asking, well, what is better? Whose better is being delivered? And who gets to decide? And when we're faced with a question like, what is better for nature? I start to get unstuck, because are we talking about sort of going back to this Edenic version that doesn't really exist? And in doing that, does it mean removing ourselves from the picture, which is effectively what I did in The Wilding of Mars? It's, biology goes a different way and we're not part of it. But it's not a hopeful position if we, to imagine our own extinction. I think part of the problem is that better is a human idea. So, for example, the organisms in this picture didn't choose their features. The ostrich didn't choose to grow a longer neck, to get a better vantage point over the other animals. Evolution happens as a relationship with context. And so when we start to impose human ideas of what bettering nature means, we get into trouble, because better ultimately has human measures. Another way to think about it is to say, well, what's better for nature is better for us. And again, I'm really interested in the conundrum that this presents. We're part of nature, so it's better for our survival to protect it. But how do we then think about design in this context? Are we always designing for ourselves, or can we ever be altruistic in the way we design? So one of the sort of ways I've been thinking, especially over the last year, is about what I see, or I'm feeling, is a crisis of imagination and also a crisis of action. In my work, I'm trying to find ways to ask questions, to kind of do research through these works, to tell stories, to imagine alternatives, and to give agency to an audience. So I'm going to show 2 more projects, and hopefully some of these sort of questions may arise through them, and you'll see why I'm working in this way. So this was another sort of big project that I undertook in 2019 and is ongoing. And it's a collaboration between myself, a biotechnology company called Ginkgo Bioworks, and a smell artist and researcher, Cecil Tolas. And I'll just let you listen to the sound. If the video is glitching, I've sent the link is available. So what you just saw in that video was a reconstruction of the back of Table Mountain in Cape Town. And it's a reconstruction of about the year 1912. And the flower that was at the end of the video is called the Leucadendron grandiflorum, or I should say was called the Leucadendron grandiflorum, because it is now extinct. And it actually was last seen in 1806 in a collector's garden in London. And the plant is on the right-hand side of this photograph. And what you see now are 3 different extinct plants. And in 2016, Christina Agapakis, who is the creative director of Ginkgo Bioworks, went to the Harvard University Herbarium, and she was looking for extinct flowers in the collections. And she found 20 that morning, including these 3. One is a hibiscus from Hawaii, the middle one is a scurf pea from Ohio, and on the right is the one from Cape Town. And she took tiny tissue samples of each of these plants. And from those samples, the team at Ginkgo were able to extract DNA and analyze those fragments and start to work out what smell molecules each plant may have produced using the technology of synthetic biology. So once they started to match sequences of DNA, match them up with known passages from other organisms, so known sequences that produce different smelly molecules, and then start to kind of fill in the holes in the puzzle. And then they printed those sequences of DNA. They synthesized them and inserted them into yeast and grew those molecules from the yeast to check that those sequences indeed produce those different smells. And ultimately, in the end, what you get is a list of smelly molecules for each of the 3 plants, which is a kind of extraordinary achievement, I think, which is why I got involved in the project. This is Cecil in her studio, which is actually a lab in Berlin, who then, from those lists, reconstructed the smell of each flower. And of course, we can't really know the smell of each flower because we don't know the quantities of those molecules, or whether those genes were turned on, or whether those genes were actually involved in the flower themselves. But the idea is, again, to kind of show that technology isn't a solution, but it can give us this sort of blurry glimpse into the past. And what we've done is create a series of installations that explore different ways of actually experiencing the smell. And this is the most recent, which is at the Natural History Museum in Bern as part of an exhibition called Apocalypse. And you enter this door without really knowing where you're going, and you end up inside a diorama. And on the ground are large boulders. These are limestone boulders. And in the air is the smell of one of the flowers. In this case, it's the Urbexulum stipulatum, the scurf pea from Ohio, which once grew on this rocky limestone island. The sound is a soundscape of the reconstructed landscape. And what you can do is you can sit on the rocks and smell a lost flower in this abstract space. You then leave the diorama, and then you can watch other humans in this extinction diorama, watching them as part of the experience of extinction. So instead of seeing a stuffed animal, like a rhino in a box, you see humans experiencing the loss of nature. I haven't actually experienced this installation because it opened just before lockdown last year. But the project is really kind of a complex synthesis of different practices, and unraveling the story of these plants as a whole. There's so much research and interesting sort of conundrums that appear about each of them as we start to see the impact of colonialism, which is the reason that each of these flowers was lost. Colonial action, from cattle ranching, dam building and vineyards, has all that has left us with is this imperfect trace of sort of a memory of a place that we've never been. I think that for me, this project is sort of, again, sort of took me to this place where we can start to tell these stories about landscapes and find new ways to experience them. But what I've been struggling with is, how do I then give agency to audiences? What am I supposed to do? If I'm kind of going to see this, I can feel this extreme sense of loss, but what happens next? So I'll finish by talking about what I've been working on for the last year, which for me is an experiment in trying to do this next thing. And also, I think resonates with a lot of the sort of discussion in the previous presentation as well. So the project, I can't tell you the name yet, it's just the Pollinator Commission, and it's for the Eden project in Cornwall, which maybe you know, which is this wonderful sort of, I call it a nature theme park, which is not what it's meant to be called, but it's different from a botanical garden because there's a much more hands-on way of experiencing nature and engendering a feeling of hope, awe, connection, jeopardy and agency with the natural world. So I won this commission last year, and this is the site, so maybe it gives you a sense of the scale. That's the bit marked green at the bottom of this drawing. And I was asked to propose a sculpture for this site that would be about pollinators. And I decided that with such a big bit of ground, I didn't want to make a work about pollinators, I wanted to make a work for pollinators. So that was the beginning. And as I started to research and try and understand these species more, I realized that they see the world completely different to us. So in these images, what you see in the bottom left and bottom right of each block is the way a butterfly and a bee see the same flower, which is what we see as the top left. And you start to realize that when we look at a landscape, we perceive it in one way, but on the right, this would be how a bee sees the same colors. It's completely different. And again, we sort of see things close up in sharp detail and can zoom away, but a bee, as it travels away, just 14 centimeters away from the flower, just sees the blur that you see in the bottom row. Not only that, is bees experience, as an example of one kind of pollinator, they are able to memorize the locations of flowers. So they are able to solve very complex routing problems and find the fastest route possible. They may visit 10,000 flowers in a day. So optimizing that route is incredibly important. So based on this research, I proposed that I would create an algorithm that designs gardens that are optimized for pollinators, not for human aesthetics. So that's what I've been working on, is how do you then create this algorithm that creates gardens that are not for our needs? They're artworks for pollinators and are based on plant lists that maximize benefits for different species of pollinators, that maximize the attractiveness and easiness of forage for different pollinators, and makes optimization decisions that humans would not be able to calculate in balancing a garden ultimately that is designed to be the most empathetic for other species. So the most diverse is how I've defined that, for other species, to create a very different kind of garden. So this is another sketch of what that garden may look like. And we've created this algorithm, started generating the first schemes last week. And it's incredibly exciting because the Eden horticulturalists are sort of slightly horrified at the planting combinations, the color range. So we have all the colors in one garden because different pollinators see different colors. There's sort of mad squiggles and roots around them, which follow bee trap lines and so on. And it's part of a bigger project, which is for me, is actually not so much an artwork, but an art-led campaign. So the idea is that we have a kind of a whole system to expand this project. We start, so you see on the top left, with regional plant palettes. So we have a UK-wide plant palette to start with, which the algorithm then draws on. And then we start to create gardens with this. So the Eden garden will be the first edition garden. The next step is we're putting the algorithm online, creating a website where anyone will be able to use this tool to create their own artwork, which then they can plant as a DIY edition. The idea of creating more edition gardens around the world means that we can create more regional plant palettes and then seed more local DIY editions as well. So the idea is that hopefully we can create gardens on small scale as well as these large scale artworks. And for me, it's a way of, in a way, using art as a Trojan horse to create more space for pollinators, but also to remake a portion of the world from their perspective. These are unnatural gardens, but they're designed for nature. And this sort of brings back, just to finish, to this question that I've been wrestling with is, well, what is better for nature? And how do we as humans start to imagine better for all species, not just for ourselves? And within that, we start to ask, well, who imagines? Who decides? And when it comes to the question of design, whether it's designing landscapes or technological solutions, it's really, for me, is this question of how can we be empathetic and altruistic to other species? So this is my mantra, is, as I am obsessed with the word better, is trying to think about constantly, who am I trying to design for and how do I do it better? So I'll end there, and I hope that has totally changed the kind of the proceedings in a way, because I think that it's totally different to what you've seen before. So I'm really excited to hear how it fits in with the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. That was, wow, somebody just wrote breathtaking, and I think I'll stick to that word. Thank you very much for letting us see into your work. I have a question for you. What can you tell us about art as a campaigning tool or a vehicle for our relationship with nature, actually? What happens to us if we see nature or develop an artistic relationship with nature?
I mean, I think, so for me personally, that question has come from, which I alluded to, the sort of struggle with the gallery as a space to be talking about extinction and our relationship with the natural world. It's a place to explore those relationships through, certainly when I'm dealing with extinct species, like dealing with loss, it's hard to recreate extinct species inside or outside the gallery. But I really wanted to step outside and to start to think about, well, how can we use the value of this approach? It's not a utilitarian approach. I'm not trying to solve any problems. I talked about solutionism. This isn't going to solve the pollinator problem, but it's a different way. It's using the ability of art to change our perspective, to enable us to think differently, to shock us, see differently, feel some different kinds of emotions that are not in the service of function. So that for me is an interesting way to approach the problem. I'm sort of challenged by, well, what can I do to help from the practice that I have already? I can do much more as an activist or as a citizen, voting differently, but what can I do with the skills that I have?
Thank you. I think that's an important question for all of us. I have a few. I have lots of comments in the chat. A lot of people who were interested in the algorithm and want to know more detail. We shared your video links, and anybody can go there for the interview or your website or whatever. But there's Cecil who would like to know, what do you think about the seemingly inherent need of humans to shape landscapes, also foreign ones like Mars? Is it warranted to get so deeply involved in such untouched surfaces, or should they just be left alone?
I personally think we should leave Mars alone. I think scientific exploration is different from colonization, but it is in a way a first step. If we look back at the history of colonization on Earth, I think one of the questions I ask is, are humans inherently colonizers? There are other, or is this like a Western mindset, or like a mindset of modernity? I don't think it's just that. I think humans tend to take over land. But it's, the idea of transforming landscapes is not central to every culture. So destroying, transforming, but then you could say, well, with the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago, we've been changing landscapes for our own benefit. So I think that my intention of using Mars for that work is it's not a solution. It's still a violent act. If there's indigenous life on Mars, it's still going to be destroyed or affected in some way by going there and doing this. But what would it mean if we were still letting it be wild in some way, even in a managed wilderness? This is the stuff I wrestle with. I would love to know what other people think.